Greetings everyone. Today we're going to learn how to turn your photographs into watercolor paintings using Photoshop tools and brushes. Stay tuned. Photo selection is pretty important here. So you need to select a photo that stands on its own compositionally. It needs to be a good photograph. Also remember, by its very nature, watercolor can be impressionistic. Sometimes detail is implied. Your brain kind of fills in some of the missing details when looking at the washes of colors and the bleeding that sometimes happens when doing a watercolor painting. So choose a photograph where the detail isn't the most critical part of the photo. So I've decided to use this photograph of lupins and boats in a harbor in Maine, and I realize that some of the detail will be lost in those flowers in the front. To prep the photo, go into the image menu and make sure that the image is 8-bit so that all of our filters work, and also change the image to 300 dpi if it's not already set to that. That's an image size. Now is also a good time to make any changes to color balance or saturation or luminance or any of those sorts of things that you need to do before you start working with this photograph as a painting. Alright, our first step is to go over here to the Layers tab, right click on the layer that we're working on, the background in this case, and change it to a smart object. Next, head up to the filter menu and select the filter gallery. When you get into the filter gallery, select the cutout option. Now this is not intuitive, it's kind of a posterized effect. That's what you're going to see here when the computer is finished working. I would probably start with settings for maybe 5 or 6 levels, maybe 4 or 5 in terms of edge simplicity, and maybe 1 or 2 for edge fidelity. And it may not look how you think it should look at this point, and that's fine. This will be sort of a part of the image that fades into the background, a very subtle thing. After that processes, head on back up to the filter menu again and go to the filter gallery again, just like you did before. This time you're going to select dry brush, and I'll give you some starting settings here. Again, this may not look the way you think it should look at this point, and that's fine. Some good starting settings are maybe somewhere between 8 and 10 for the brush size. Obviously, the bigger the brush, the less detail you're going to have. And maybe 10 on the brush detail, maybe a little less than that. And I'd go for 1 or 2 on the texture. Next, we're going to change the blending mode on these two entries you just made into the filter gallery. And we do that to make the effects a little more subtle as we go through. So what you're going to need to do next is find those two filter gallery entries down there in your layers menu. And there's a little tiny button onto the right side of each of those filter galleries. You're going to click on those. It's going to render your smart filter. Which takes a minute depending on your computer. And you're going to change that from normal to pin light. That'll make the effect a little more subtle, a little more watercolor-ish. You're going to repeat that step, click OK and let it do its thing. And then you're going to repeat that step for the second filter in your filter gallery. So click that little button off to the right side where it says filter gallery. It's going to render that filter, and you're going to change that from normal to pin light. You'll be able to see the effects, and that effect was not quite so subtle. Now for our last filter before we start painting. So go back up to the filter menu again, and this time go to blur and select smart blur. Smart blur, you see some settings in there. I would have a threshold, probably max it out or close to maxing it out, and a radius, probably maybe 5 to 10, but you can play around with that. You can adjust these to some degree afterwards too. So you see I have the radius set pretty far left of center, and I pretty much maxed out on the threshold. Make sure you set the quality setting to high down at the bottom there. Looks like I landed on 4 in terms of the radius. I know what it should look like, and it maybe looks way more blurry than you think it should at this point, which is fine. It becomes a subtle part of what we're doing. So looking over to the right, you'll see we have a new filter in our smart filters. We now have the smart blur. We're going to click on the settings for smart blur, just like we did with the other two filters. And we're going to let it render for a moment. Now when the settings dialog opens up, I like to scroll the window down to something that's pretty important to me in the picture in terms of detail. So I pulled up one of these flower heads, and I'm going to change the blend mode to screen, and I'm going to set the opacity somewhere in the middle. I kind of like it about maybe between 40 and 70 probably. Now oftentimes in watercolors you find the outlines are more distinct. Sometimes it looks like they're drawn. It might be a multimedia thing. Sometimes they actually are drawn in. To simulate that, we're going to go to the filter menu again, and we're going to look for the sub menu that says stylize and then find edges. That's going to create a new filter over in our smart filters menu on the right side. So you're going to click on the settings for find edges. So you may be thinking, what happened to my picture at this point? And really what's going on here is we've just created the outlines around the blocks of color that are going to be in the watercolor. So when we change the blend mode this time, we're going to change it to multiply. And when we do that, it leaves just the edges that you see there as part of our composite. So select multiply and leave the opacity fairly high, maybe even all the way up, just to enhance those pencil drawn lines that are going to appear in your watercolor. Now you're going to need a piece of art paper, or an image of a piece of art paper that we call a texture, to put on top of this so that we can get that paper look to the medium that we're using. I search Google for free white art paper textures, and I click on the button for high resolution to try to get as large an image as I can. You find one that's got some texture to it that you can see. Try to find one without a watermark on it, because that may end up showing in your picture, so that also means it's There's a licensing issue, so there are plenty of free ones out there. And save that to a place where you can find it. So I saved it to my desktop. I know where that is. And what I'm going to do is go to my desktop and click on that paper image, and I'm going to drag it down to the bottom to the Photoshop application. It will open up, and I just drop it in there, and it becomes another layer on top of my picture. And yeah, I'm going to cover it up. This is kind of a subtractive process. You put the paper on top, and we're going to erase it away, and you can see the texture as it appears there. So you'll see a new layer has been formed over there in your layers section. Make sure you click on that. It's going to be important to pay attention to what layer you're working with from this point forward. Right above that layer, you'll see a box that says normal. Go ahead and click in that and change it to multiply, and that will just leave the texture superimposed on top of our watercolor-ish painting. Now select the layer with the photograph on it. Look below that layer and you'll see some icons. Select the icon for a layer mask. It's a lighter icon with a dark circle in the center, and go ahead and click on that. And you will see that a white box has now appeared next to the photograph in the layers section. Now go ahead and click on that white box. And then over on the left side, you're looking for the paint bucket tool. All right, sometimes you see a gradient tool there. It's in the same area as the gradient tool. You just right click on that gradient tool and then select paint bucket, and you'll get this paint bucket icon. You're going to come down and change your color, your primary color, to black, and then you're going to fill in this area with the black. This, in effect, makes the photograph part of your image disappear for right now. If you did it correctly, you'll see that paper image again, just that top layer, and you will see that the mask to the right of your photograph is now turned black. So if you haven't downloaded a watercolor brush set yet, now's the time to do it. Again, I use the one from McBad Shoes on DeviantArt. Many free ones out there. Sometimes you have to give credit to the creator. You're looking for one that has a diverse set of visualizations in it, a lot of things that maybe have different strokes, washes, bleeds that darken towards the edges, things that cover large areas, gradients, and those kinds of things. All of them, once you install them in Photoshop, can be resized and rotated, which you will want to do frequently as you're finishing up on this project. To install these, you find the ABR file, and you can drag it into Photoshop and it will install that way. You may have to go up to your window menu up at the top and make sure that you can see your brush settings, and you'll see your watercolor brushes in there. Alright, two really important things have to happen next. First of all, you have to make sure that you're working in the layer that has the photograph and the mask. That's going to be the one with your picture and the little black box next to it. And second, you're going to need to make sure that you change the color that you're working with back to white. White will erase the paper texture, slowly revealing your watercolor painting underneath of the paper. So it's kind of a backwards process. You're kind of subtracting the paper away. Now this next part requires a lot of experimentation and really creativity. This is the part where you're really painting the picture. In the upper right hand corner of my screen, maybe in a different place on yours, you'll see all of the different brushes that you can select. I know what the picture looks like underneath of there, and I'm going to start selecting brushes, generally a large brush. So there I just increase the size of the brush, and you can see the general shape of the brush. And if you set everything up correctly, as you click 2 or 3 times, you will see that it starts to reveal part of your picture underneath, and it does in such a way that it looks as though it's a wet process that's been used watercolor. So I'm selecting brushes that have the shapes generally to fill in the outlines of my pictures. I know there's a house up there in the upper left hand corner that I want to capture. So I will start doing really what amounts to a wash. So if there are areas such as large areas of sky or grass or something like that, I may try to do like a little bit of a wash or a mop type brush effect, much as you might do with watercolor. Um, in this case, we're kind of doing this in reverse because I don't have the outline here in front of me. I just kind of remember where the things are. I know there's a rock down in the lower left-hand corner of this picture that I would rather not have in there, and I could have taken that out beforehand. So here I've used, and I'm switching brushes frequently, so you'll see me go back and forth. I very seldom want to use the same brush twice in the same orientation. I'll use it twice if I rotate, but you don't want to have those repeated patterns that appear. So once I sort of get a vague outline of this going on, and here I'm trying to get down to where that rock is, but not quite where the rock is. I don't want the rock in there. So I know the rock is in that lower left-hand corner. And I try to get some overlapping going on. So this kind of simulates what goes on with a watercolor as the different parts of the things that are the parts of your painting, the colors can run together a little bit. Also, as water dries, sometimes the pigment will run to the outside edges and collect on the outside edges and kind of leave little rings. So I'm looking for that effect from time to time, especially on the edges where you get sort of that color bleeding effect going on. So here you see I'm filling in large areas of the outside. I'm trying to get like the outside pieces in, and I will fill in as I go. Here I've changed the shape of a brush that I've used previously, and I don't want all the way to the corner because of that rock down there. I find it distracting. I actually could have taken that out before I started doing this. It probably would have been easier. And there with that brush application, you see a little bit of that bleed going on where the pigment is a little denser towards the edges, which is often what happens when you're working with wet media. So I'm going to go in and keep filling things in just slowly and gradually, trying not to use the same brush twice, trying not to use the same orientations twice. And right now I know the middle is kind of a mess, and I will fill that in later. So let's kind of speed this along. And as I said, much of this is experimentation. Now I'm using a smaller brush, though. You can make these brushes tiny. You can actually get in there and paint detail in to the picture if you want to do that. So anyway, let's kind of speed this along. And with a little persistence, this is how it turns out. Don't get frustrated with it. Do some experimentation at the early stages and just take note of how it turns out and how it changes the final result. Thank you for joining me on this tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.